when someone goes missing, we expect answers. We expect investigations, arrests, courtroom verdicts, and closure. But what happens when not just one person vanishes, but many, all at once, and the answers never come? Tonight, we're going to talk about some of the most chilling mass kidnappings in modern history, cases where groups of people were taken, and, to this day, no one truly knows what happened to them. It was a sweltering Wednesday morning in late January of 1966, the kind of heat that makes the pavement shimmer and sends every family in the neighborhood scrambling for the coast. In the quiet Adelaide suburb of Somerton Park in South Australia, 9-year-old Jane Beaumont was getting her younger siblings ready for a trip to the beach. Arna was 7 and Grant was just 4, and for the 3 of them, this was about as good as life got during summer holidays. The beach at Glenelg was only about 3 kilometers from their house on Harding Street, a quick bus ride that Jane, the eldest, had made plenty of times before. Their father, Jim, a taxi driver and former serviceman, had dropped the kids off at that same beach the day before, and they'd come home safely, sunburnt and sandy and full of stories. So when the 3 of them asked their mother Nancy if they could go again on the morning of January 26th, Australia Day, she said yes without much hesitation. That was how things worked in 1966. Children roamed, neighborhoods looked after each other, doors stayed unlocked, and kids came home when the streetlights came on. Nancy watched the 3 of them board the bus at 8:45 that morning. Jane wore a green and gold checked outfit. Arna had on a red and white cotton dress, and little Grant was in his swimming trunks and a white shirt. They carried a small amount of money between them, a few coins really, enough for the bus fare and maybe a treat from one of the shops near the beach, and Nancy told them to be back on the noon bus. She expected them home by 12:30, 1 o'clock at the latest. It was a routine they had practiced before. Jane was a responsible girl, protective of her younger siblings, and Nancy had no reason to believe that Wednesday would be any different from the last trip to Glenelg. But then the noon bus came and went. The children weren't on it. Nancy watched from the front of the house, scanning the street, expecting to see the 3 of them walking up the road with wet hair and sandy feet any moment. The 2 o'clock bus came and went too. By then, Nancy was starting to feel the first cold fingers of worry pulling at her chest. She tried to tell herself they had simply lost track of time, that they were splashing around in the shallows or watching a street performer or exploring the jetty. But as the afternoon heat settled in and the silence of the house grew louder, the feeling that something was deeply wrong kept growing. Jim arrived home unexpectedly early from a sales trip around 3:30, took one look at Nancy's face, and the 2 of them headed straight for the beach. They searched the sand, the boardwalk, the changing rooms, the grassy reserves, and the fish and chip shops, calling the children's names until their voices gave out. By the time they realized Jane, Arna, and Grant were genuinely not coming back, a panic had set in that would ripple across the entire country. Within hours, one of the largest searches in South Australian history was underway. Police combed Glenelg Beach and the surrounding streets. Boats from the Sea Rescue Squadron joined. Airports and train stations were alerted. Roadblocks went up at the borders of the state. Taxi drivers, many of whom knew Jim personally, carried word of the missing children through every street and suburb. Jane's entire Brownie troop fanned out across the area, searching in packs. Reporters descended on the Beaumont home, and Jim stood on his back porch addressing them, his voice cracking. He said somebody had to be holding them against their will, that they would have come home otherwise. He called it a complete mystery and said his children would be crying their eyes out. What investigators pieced together over the following days made the whole thing even more disturbing. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the 3 Beaumont children on the beach that morning, and they weren't alone. A tall, thin-faced man with fair to light brown hair and a sun-tanned complexion, estimated to be in his mid-30s, was spotted playing with the children near the water, chasing them through the sprinklers at Kali Reserve, and apparently buying them lunch. One witness saw the children at Wenzel's Cake Shop on Mosley Street around midday, where Jane used a 1-pound note to buy a meat pie and pasties for her siblings. This was unusual because Nancy had only given them enough coins for the bus fare and a small treat. The money had come from somewhere, and investigators believed the tall man had given it to them. Another witness saw the children lying on their stomachs on the grass near the beach, with this same man sitting cross-legged beside them. They appeared relaxed, comfortable, even laughing. At around noon, the man was seen helping the children gather up their belongings and walk away from the beach. They headed south along the road in the direction away from the bus stop, and that was the last time anyone saw Jane, Arna, or Grant Beaumont alive. The police sketch of the unidentified man was published widely. It showed a thin-faced individual with a somewhat angular nose and parted hair. Hundreds of calls poured in, but no identification was ever made. In the weeks that followed, supposed sightings of the children came from all over Australia, from Perth to Brisbane, none of which led anywhere. A Dutch psychic named Gerard Croiset contacted a local newspaper and claimed the children had suffocated in a collapsed tunnel and were buried near the beach. Hundreds of people swarmed the area to dig, turning the seaside into something between a vigil and a circus. They found nothing. Over the decades, the list of suspects grew long, but led nowhere conclusive. Bevan Spencer von Einem, a convicted child killer already serving a life sentence for the 1983 murder of a 15-year-old boy, reportedly bragged to associates about having abducted 3 children from a beach and conducting experiments on them. He said one of them died during the procedures, so he killed the other 2 and dumped all 3 bodies in the bushland south of Adelaide. While von Einem was known to frequent Glenelg Beach, he was only about 20 years old in 1966, younger than the man witnesses described. Arthur Stanley Brown, who was later charged with the abduction and murder of 2 young sisters in Queensland in 1970, bore a striking resemblance to the composite sketches from both the Beaumont case and a later, possibly related, abduction at the Adelaide Oval in 1973. But no employment records survived to prove Brown had ever been in Adelaide at the time. Another suspect, a former scoutmaster named Alan Anthony Monroe, who had pleaded guilty to 10 child sex offenses spanning decades, was linked to the case when an acquaintance claimed Monroe had arrived at his home with the children's bodies in the boot of his car. But the claim was secondhand, and Monroe, who had fled to Cambodia, was never charged. Jim and Nancy Beaumont stayed in their house on Harding Street for years after the disappearance, keeping the children's bedrooms exactly as they had left them, hoping against all reason that their children might somehow find their way home. Friends and neighbors would drop by with casseroles and kind words, but there was nothing anyone could say. The house became a kind of shrine and a prison at the same time. Every knock on the door brought a flash of hope, followed by the familiar weight of disappointment. Every news report about an unidentified child found somewhere in the country sent them into a spiral of agonized anticipation. Over the years, claimed sightings poured in from every corner of Australia. A woman in Perth insisted she was living next door to the children. a former detective on the case became convinced in 1997 that Jane Beaumont was alive and living in Canberra. Investigators looked into it. It wasn't her. Eventually, the weight of the grief was more than the marriage could bear. Jim and Nancy separated and moved away from the home they had shared with their children. Nancy died in September 2019, at the age of 92, without ever knowing what happened to Jane, Arna, or Grant. Jim, as of recent reports, remained alive but entirely out of the public eye, still carrying the question he asked reporters from his back porch in 1966, the question that has never been answered. The case remains open. The South Australian government has offered a $1 million reward for information. But nearly 60 years later, the Beaumont children have never been found, and the man seen playing with them on the beach that hot January day has never been identified. The Beaumont case changed Australia forever. It shattered the assumption that children were safe in public, that daylight and open spaces offered protection, and that strangers at the beach were simply friendly. But it was far from the only case of its kind. 8 years later, on the other side of the world, a strikingly similar nightmare played out in a place just as ordinary, just as assumed to be safe, and its echoes have lingered for half a century. It was the Monday before Christmas, December 23, 1974, in Fort Worth, Texas, and the city was buzzing with last-minute shoppers, children on school break, and families trying to squeeze in final preparations for the holiday. That morning, 17-year-old Mary Rachel Terlika, who went by her middle name, Rachel, climbed into her 1972 Oldsmobile 98 and headed out to do some Christmas shopping with her friend, 14-year-old Lisa Renee Wilson, who everyone called Renee. Rachel had been married for about 6 months to a man named Tommy Terlika, and she lived with him and her older sister Deborah. She was still a high school student at Southwest High School, juggling the responsibilities of being a young wife, a stepmother to Tommy's 2-year-old son, and a teenager all at once. Renee's boyfriend, 15-year-old Terry Mosley, was originally supposed to join them, but had made plans to visit a friend in the hospital. So it was just Rachel and Renee until 9-year-old Julie Ann Mosley, Terry's youngest sister, caught wind of the outing and begged to come along. Julie didn't want to spend the day alone. She called her mother Ray Ann at work, pleading and whining until Ray Ann finally relented, telling Julie to be home by 6 o'clock. The older girls, specifically Renee, wanted to be back by 4 because she had a Christmas party to attend that evening with Terry. The 3 girls left just before noon. Their first stop was an Army-Navy surplus store where Renee had some jeans on layaway. After picking those up, they drove to the Seminary South Shopping Center, a large mall in South Fort Worth, and parked Rachel's Oldsmobile on the upper level of the Sears parking lot. Several witnesses later reported seeing the girls inside the mall during the afternoon. They appeared to be shopping normally, browsing stores, carrying bags, doing exactly what you'd expect 3 girls to be doing the day before Christmas Eve. But when 4 o'clock came, Renee was not home. When 5 o'clock came, the families started to worry. By 6, Julie's curfew had passed, and no one had heard a word. The families drove to Seminary South and found Rachel's car still sitting in the Sears lot, locked. Inside, they could see the items Renee had picked up from the Army-Navy store and a wrapped Christmas present she had brought for Rachel's stepson. It appeared that the girls had returned to the car at some point during the day and placed their purchases inside. But the girls themselves were simply gone. Rachel's mother went to the mall, into every single store, asking managers to make announcements over the PA system. There was no response. The family stayed at the mall all night, waiting, hoping, and watching for any sign of the three girls. When they didn't appear by morning, police were called and the case was handed to the youth division of the Fort Worth Police Department's Missing Persons Bureau. And then, almost immediately, investigators made the decision that would haunt this case for decades. They classified the three girls as runaways. That classification was reinforced the very next morning, Christmas Eve, when Tommy Trelika received a letter in the mail. The envelope had Rachel's name scrawled in the upper left corner, written in pencil, and it was addressed to Thomas A. Trelika, a formality that Rachel never used. She always called him Tommy. Inside, written in ink on a piece of paper wider than the envelope, was a brief message that read, "I know I'm going to catch it, but we had to get away. We're going to Houston. See you in about a week. The car is in the Sears upper lot. Love, Rachel." The families rejected the letter immediately. Rachel's mother insisted it wasn't her handwriting. The formal address, the fact that Rachel appeared to have been initially misspelled in the corner with the L written first as an E, and then corrected, the ink mismatch with the pencil on the envelope, the fact that a 9-year-old girl would never voluntarily run away from home 2 days before Christmas, all of it screamed that something was very, very wrong. Renee's mother, Judy Wilson, was emphatic, telling anyone who would listen that her daughter wanted to attend that Christmas party, and no 9-year-old runs away right before Christmas morning. The postmark on the envelope was blurred, showing only a partial zip code that investigators believed corresponded to either Eliasville or Weatherford, Texas, both west of Fort Worth. The letter has since been tested for DNA, but yielded no match, and handwriting experts, including those from the FBI, have produced only inconclusive results. Frustrated with the police investigation, the three families pooled their resources and hired a private detective named John Swaim. In 1975, Swaim uncovered that a 28-year-old man who had worked at a local store where Rachel had applied for a job before her disappearance had been making obscene phone calls in the area. He was using his position to obtain personal information from young women through their job applications. The man had even lived in Rachel's parents' neighborhood before moving away shortly before her marriage. Despite passing this information to the Fort Worth Police Department, nothing came of the lead. Over the years, countless tips, dives, searches, and theories have produced no answers. In April 1975, the private detective Swaim traveled to Port Lavaca, Texas, with 100 volunteers to search under local bridges after receiving a tip that the girls had been killed and their bodies dumped there. They found nothing. The following year, a self-described professional dowser from Hawaii wrote to Swaim, claiming the girls had been killed and their bodies left in brush near a gas well in rural Eastland County. Family members, desperate after 16 months, traveled to the location and joined 40 law enforcement officers and volunteers in beating through the brush among the jackrabbits and oil rigs for 5 hours. They found nothing, and the dowser was promptly dismissed. Over the decades, roughly 60% of the psychics consulted by the families claimed that a blue hippie van was involved in the disappearance. The same percentage believed the girls had traveled north, not south, as the letter claimed. In 1981, human remains found in a swampy area of Brazoria County raised hopes, but testing showed the bones didn't belong to any of the three girls. A witness eventually came forward and told a store clerk that she had observed 3 girls being forced into a yellow pickup truck near a grocery store not far from the mall. But when investigators tried to locate this woman for a follow-up statement, she could not be found, and the lead went cold. In January 2001, the case was finally reopened and assigned to a homicide detective named Tom Bocher, who publicly stated he believed the girls left the mall with someone they trusted and that more than one person was involved. He told reporters that investigators could confirm the girls were at one point seen with one individual. In 2018, Rachel's brother Rusty Arnold organized a dive effort in Benbrook Lake, about 8 miles from the shopping center, raising over $15,000 and pulling 3 cars from the water. None had any connection to the case. Investigators also explored possible connections to other unsolved abductions in 1970s Texas, including the 1974 murder of a young woman named Carla Walker in Fort Worth, which was solved decades later through DNA evidence. But no links to the missing trio have ever been established. Tommy Trelica put up a $2,000 reward shortly after the disappearance, but withdrew it within a year. He filed for divorce from Rachel on the grounds of abandonment less than 2 years later, moved away from Fort Worth, remarried multiple times over the ensuing decades, and has consistently maintained his innocence of any involvement. Rachel's father, Cotton Arnold, was terminally ill with stage 4 cancer when she went missing. He spent his final months in agony, not just from the disease eating away at his body, but from the unbearable knowledge that his daughter was gone and he would die without knowing why. He passed away just 4 months after the disappearance. Renee's family still lives in the same Fort Worth neighborhood, in the same house where Renee grew up, as if leaving would mean giving up on her. Terry Mosley, now in his mid-60s, has spent his entire adult life wondering what happened to his girlfriend and his little sister. He told a reporter in 2025 that he never dreamed he would be 66 years old and still talking about how the case was crazy and unsolvable. But there he was, still talking, still waiting, still hoping. Rachel Trelica, Renee Wilson, and Julianne Mosley have been missing for over 50 years. No bodies have ever been recovered. No arrests have ever been made. No one has ever been charged. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has created age-progressed images of all 3 girls, showing what they might look like today as women in their 50s and 60s. Those images circulate on social media, on billboards, and on the Facebook page that Rusty Arnold administers. A page with over 13,000 members from all over the world. And somewhere, in whatever reality exists beyond the parking lot of a Texas mall the day before Christmas, 3 girls are still waiting to be found. The heartbreak of the Fort Worth case is the kind that settles into a community's bones and never leaves, the kind where decades pass and the questions only get louder. And it's a particular cruelty when the vanishing happens not on some desolate highway or in some far-flung wilderness, but in the most ordinary and intimate of places, like a home. That's exactly what happened in the heartland of Missouri, on a night that should have been one of the happiest of 3 women's lives. June 6, 1992, was a Saturday, and for 19-year-old Suzanne Susie Streeter and 18-year-old Stacy Kathleen McCall, it was the biggest day of their young lives. They had graduated from Kickapoo High School in Springfield, Missouri, caps and gowns and everything. The whole world was in front of them. Susie, a brown-eyed girl with a bleached blonde mane and a small tumor on the corner of her mouth, was planning to work at a local movie theater. Stacy, with long dark blonde hair and freckles and a dimple in her chin, was going to keep her job at the Springfield Gymnastics Center. That night, after a celebratory dinner with their respective families, the 2 girls headed out to hit some graduation parties. Back at 1717 East Delmar Street, Susie's mother, 47-year-old Cheryl Levitt, stayed behind. She was a petite woman, barely 5 feet tall, with short, bleached blonde curly hair and freckles on her neck. She worked as a cosmetologist at a local salon and was known for being close with her daughter. That evening, Cheryl turned down a dinner invitation and instead stayed home, eating takeout pizza with Susie before her daughter went out for the night. The last person to speak with Cheryl was a friend who called at about 11:15 that night. They talked about painting a chest of drawers. Everything was normal. Susie and Stacy bounced around to a couple of parties that evening. Their original plan had been to drive with some friends to Branson the next morning to visit a water park called White Water, and they intended to crash at their friend Janelle Kirby's house in Battlefield for the night. But when the evening wore on and Janelle's house got too crowded, the two girls changed plans. They'd go to Susie's house on Delmar Street instead, spend the night there, and meet up with the group in the morning. They left the last party at about 2:15 in the morning on June 7th. It was a last-minute change, one that no one could have predicted, and it would be the last time anyone saw them alive. The next morning, when Susie and Stacy didn't show up for the water park trip and didn't answer the phone, Janelle Kirby and her boyfriend Mike Henson drove over to Delmar Street to check on them. They arrived around noon and found all 3 women's cars parked in the driveway and the carport. Susie's red Ford Escort was in the curved driveway. Stacy's Toyota Corolla was parked behind it, and Cheryl's blue Corsica was in the carport as usual. The front door was unlocked. But walking up to the porch, Janelle noticed something odd. A glass globe that covered the porch light had been shattered. The light itself was still on, burning in the middle of the day, and broken glass was scattered across the porch. Inside, the house was quiet. The television was on. The dog, a small Yorkshire Terrier named Cinnamon, was agitated but unharmed. Cheryl's bed appeared to have been slept in. Susie and Stacy's purses were on the floor near the bedroom, and their jewelry and cigarettes were lying on the dresser. Keys sat untouched. Clothing from the graduation parties was neatly folded. Nothing appeared stolen, nothing was overturned, and there was no sign of a violent struggle. It was as if the 3 women had simply evaporated from the house in the middle of the night. Janelle, not realizing the significance of what she was seeing, swept up the broken glass from the porch before police arrived, accidentally destroying what may have been the single most important piece of physical evidence in the case. By the time Springfield police were notified of the disappearance that evening, at around 9 o'clock, somewhere between 10 and 20 people had already walked through the home, contaminating whatever trace evidence might have remained. Even the voicemails Janice McCall had left throughout the day were inadvertently erased when someone picked up the phone. There was another disturbing detail that emerged from those first hours. Before Janelle and her boyfriend arrived at the house that morning, as they were leaving the graduation party the night before, Janelle had answered a strange and disturbing phone call at the party house. An unidentified male made sexual innuendos on the line. She hung up. Almost immediately, the phone rang again, and the same voice was on the other end, more aggressive this time. She hung up again. According to Springfield Police Detective David Asher, the calls were obscene, with the caller using profanity and refusing to identify himself. Janelle later described the caller as sounding young, teenish even. Susie had apparently been receiving similar prank calls at the Delmar Street house since moving in with her mother that spring. Whether those calls were connected to the disappearance has never been determined, but the timing was difficult to ignore. Stacy McCall's mother, Janice, had spent the day growing increasingly frantic. she'd called the house several times, leaving voicemails that grew more upset with each attempt. When word reached her that no one had seen Stacy since the early hours of the morning, and that Susie and Cheryl were also missing, the full weight of the situation crashed down. In a 2017 interview, Janice said she had expected her daughter home that night, or the next day, maybe a couple of days afterward. She said she never in her wildest imagination thought she'd still be saying Stacy was missing a quarter century later. The investigation that followed was sprawling and maddeningly inconclusive. The broken porch light remained the only possible sign that something had gone wrong, but even that was debated. Some investigators thought the globe had simply fallen and shattered from heat or age. Others believed it was deliberately broken by someone trying to darken the porch before entering the house. On New Year's Eve 1992, an anonymous man called the America's Most Wanted hotline with information that police said demonstrated prime knowledge of the abductions. But the call was disconnected when a switchboard operator tried to link it to Springfield investigators, and the man never called back. Several persons of interest surfaced over the years. Robert Craig Cox, a convicted armed robber and former Green Beret, had been in Springfield at the time of the disappearances and had a connection to Stacy McCall's father through a car lot where they both worked. In a 1996 prison interview, Cox told a reporter he believed the three women were dead and their bodies would never be found. He never explicitly confessed, and police considered him an unreliable narrator, but he remained a person of interest for years. Another name that circulated was Dustin Rekla, a former boyfriend of Susie's who had been implicated in vandalizing a mausoleum and stealing gold fillings from corpses. Susie had reportedly given police a statement about the incident, leading to speculation that she might have been targeted in retaliation. But Rekla was never charged in connection with the disappearances. In 2007, a local reporter named Kathy Baird arranged for ground-penetrating radar to be used beneath the south parking garage of Cox Hospital, following a tip-off that the women's bodies might be buried there. The scan detected 3 anomalies shaped like potential burial sites. Springfield police, however, dismissed the theory as improbable and declined to excavate, citing cost and lack of substantiation. In 1993, investigators searched a 40-acre property in Webster County using backhoes, digging massive holes. They found 2 pieces of possible evidence: a substance that could have been blood and a section of a green vehicle that might have matched a green van witnesses reported seeing in 1992. But the blood evidence, when sent to a lab, came back inconclusive. Cheryl Levitt and Susie Streeter were declared legally dead in 1997, though the case files remain officially listed under missing. As of 2025, the Springfield Police Department, assisted by the FBI and Missouri State Highway Patrol, says it has conducted an extensive investigation, processed thousands of leads, and spoken with hundreds of witnesses and persons of interest. But there have been no positive leads regarding the women's location or the reason for their disappearance. More than 3 decades after Susie and Stacy threw their graduation caps in the air, no one knows where they are. The cruelty of these cases, the ones that take place in familiar settings and seem to defy every expectation of safety, carries a particular kind of horror. You can check the locks, you can stay in your neighborhood, you can do everything right, and still, the world can reach in and take everything from you. But some kidnappings aren't carried out by shadows in the night. Some are carried out in broad daylight, by the very people sworn to protect citizens. And few cases illustrate that betrayal more viscerally than what happened in a small city in southern Mexico on a warm September night in 2014. On the evening of September 26, 2014, more than 100 students from the Ayotzinapa Rural Teachers College, officially known as the Escuela Normal Rural Raúl Isidro Burgos, set out from their campus in Tixtla, in the southern Mexican state of Guerrero, heading toward the city of Iguala. These were young men, most of them from poor, rural, indigenous families, training to become school teachers. The college was a breeding ground for left-wing activism, and its students had a long tradition of commandeering commercial passenger buses to use for transportation to protests and demonstrations. It was a practice that was widely known, largely tolerated, and had never before been met with lethal force. That night, the students planned to travel to Mexico City to participate in a march commemorating the anniversary of the 1968 Tlatelolco massacre, a notorious event in which Mexican government forces opened fire on unarmed student demonstrators. They left their campus in 2 previously commandeered buses, and along the way, attempted to take additional buses. A bus driver told the students he needed to drop off his passengers in Iguala first, so they followed him to the bus station there, where they commandeered 3 more buses. In total, the students left Iguala in 5 buses, divided into 3 groups heading in different directions as they tried to reach the highway back to Ayotzinapa. What happened next was coordinated, savage, and deeply entangled with the machinery of corruption that runs through every level of Mexican society. At approximately 9:30 that evening, municipal police from Iguala and the neighboring town of Cocula intercepted the students' buses. The officers opened fire without warning. Students dove under seats, climbed out windows, and scrambled into the dark streets as bullets shattered the bus windows. Over the course of 3 horrifying hours, all 3 groups of students, traveling on separate routes out of the city, were pursued, intercepted, and attacked by security forces in a coordinated campaign that spanned multiple locations across Iguala. It was not one ambush, it was a siege. 3 students and 3 bystanders were killed in the shootings. 25 more were injured, some critically. A bus driver described how officers forced his vehicle to stop, smashed the windows with batons and stones, and threw tear gas canisters inside before pulling the students out and placing them face down on the ground with their hands bound. When one officer remarked that the detainees would not fit in the patrol cars, his companion told him not to worry, that more vehicles were on the way from the nearby city of Huitzuco. Minutes later, 3 more police cars arrived and the students were loaded in. That was the last verified sighting of them alive. 43 students, most of them freshmen, who had only been at the school for a few weeks and barely knew each other's names, were forcibly taken by police and vanished into the Mexican night. What investigators later discovered through the C4 communication system, a shared surveillance network used by federal police, state police, municipal police, and the military, was that all of the security forces in the area had been aware of the attacks as they unfolded. They had monitored the students' movements even before they arrived in Iguala. Recordings showed that federal police, state police, and military officials knew the students were being shot at and detained, and not one of them intervened to protect them. The violence didn't stop there. In the chaos of that night, police and members of the Guerreros Unidos drug cartel, who operated in close collusion with local authorities, also attacked a bus carrying a youth soccer team that was returning from a match. They killed the bus driver, a 15-year-old player, and a female bystander before realizing their mistake. The next morning, the body of a student named Julio Cesar Mondragon, 22 years old and a new father, was found dumped in the middle of a busy street. His face and eyes had been torn off, Within days, 22 Iguala municipal police officers were arrested. Mass graves were discovered on the outskirts of the city, yielding at least 28 bodies. But DNA testing proved none of them belonged to the missing students. This was, in a grim and ironic twist, briefly a cause for hope, as some believed the students might still be alive. The official investigation, led by then Attorney General Jesus Murillo Karam, eventually produced what the government called the historic truth, a narrative in which corrupt municipal police, acting on orders from Iguala Mayor Jose Luis Abarca and his wife Maria de Los Angeles Pineda, had handed the 43 students over to the Guerreros Unidos cartel. According to this version, the cartel killed the students and incinerated their bodies at a garbage dump in the nearby town of Cocula, burning them to ash using tires, wood, and diesel fuel before dumping the remains in the San Juan River. This account was almost immediately rejected by families, activists, and independent experts. An international team of investigators appointed by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights concluded that the incineration theory was scientifically impossible. They pointed out that reducing 43 human bodies to ash and small bone fragments would have required somewhere between 30 and 66 tons of fuel, far exceeding the materials allegedly used. They also found evidence of torture in the confessions of detained suspects, irregularities in how evidence was handled, and indications that federal police and the Mexican military had been far more involved in the events of that night than the government admitted. In fact, later investigations revealed that federal police had intercepted a fifth bus used by the students, one that may have been carrying a drug shipment, and escorted it away from Iguala. The students on that bus were among the disappeared. A government truth commission established years later, under President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, declared the disappearances a state crime and revealed that 6 of the 43 students had allegedly been kept alive in a warehouse for several days before being handed over to a local army commander who ordered them killed. This account directly implicated the Mexican military, shattering the previous government's insistence that federal forces played no role. As of 2025, more than a decade after the events in Iguala, only 3 of the 43 students' remains have been identified through forensic analysis, including fragments confirmed by a specialized laboratory at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. The remaining 40 are still classified as missing. 80 or more suspects have been arrested in connection with the case over the years, including dozens of police officers, cartel members, and local officials. Mayor Abarca and his wife were eventually captured in Mexico City. Former Attorney General Murillo Karam was himself arrested in 2022 and charged with forced disappearance and official misconduct for allegedly fabricating the historic truth to quickly close the case. And yet, despite mass protests that rocked Mexico for months, despite international condemnation, despite the hashtag Ayotzinapa Vive appearing on walls and banners from Guerrero to New York, no one has been held fully accountable for the disappearance of 43 young men who just wanted to be school teachers. The parents of the missing students have marched through the streets of Mexico City on the 26th of every month for more than 10 years. They carry banners with their sons' faces printed on them, photos frozen in time, showing young men who will never grow older in those images. They chant their names. They refuse to stop. One mother, Joaquina Garcia, whose son Martin Getsemani Sanchez is among the disappeared, said she had held out hope through 2 administrations, but that in the end, the government protects the military, and that is not fair. another father, Margarito Guerrero, whose son Josivani Guerrero de la Cruz had his bone fragments identified years later, said he could never have imagined that so much time would pass and he would still be marching without answers. Thousands continue to march alongside the families, year after year, in rain and sun, because the movement's slogan has become a kind of prayer that refuses to die. The slogan translates to, "You thought you could bury us, but we are seeds." For the people of Iguala and the surrounding communities, the horror did not end with the students. In the months and years after the disappearance, civilian search groups looking for the 43 students uncovered dozens of mass graves scattered across the hillsides around the city, graves that had nothing to do with the students. By one count, at least 129 other bodies were found, none of them the missing 43, all of them someone else's son or daughter or parent. A community organizer named Miguel Angel Jimenez, who led unofficial searches for the students in the weeks after the attack, and later helped organize the relatives of other disappeared people, was shot and killed by gunmen while driving his taxi in August 2015. His murder, like the disappearance of the students he fought to find, remains unsolved. The Ayotzinapa case exposed a wound in Mexican society that has never healed, a world in which police and drug traffickers are indistinguishable, in which the state can devour its own children and then spend a decade lying about it. And while the scale of that horror belongs uniquely to Mexico's ongoing nightmare, the weaponization of authority against the young and vulnerable has played out on other continents too, in even larger numbers and with equally devastating consequences. On the night of April 14th, 2014, about 5 months before the Ayotzinapa students disappeared in Mexico, a convoy of armed men rolled into the quiet town of Chibok in Borno State, northeastern Nigeria. They were members of Boko Haram, a militant Islamist group whose name roughly translates to "Western education is forbidden," and who had been waging a brutal insurgency across the region since 2009. By 2014, tens of thousands of people had already been killed in the conflict, and the Nigerian government had declared a state of emergency across 3 northeastern states. But what happened that night in Chibok would become the most notorious mass kidnapping in the group's bloody history. Residents of Chibok had received phone calls from neighboring villages hours earlier, warning them that a convoy of armed insurgents had been spotted heading in their direction. But no military reinforcement came. The Nigerian army had recently pulled a checkpoint out of the town, a decision the governor of Yobe State would later publicly blame on the military. When the militants arrived at the government girls' secondary school, they came disguised as Nigerian soldiers, wearing matching military uniforms, and told the students they were there to protect them. Inside the school, 276 girls between the ages of 16 and 18, the vast majority of them Christian, with some Muslim students, were preparing for their final exams. What should have been a week of studying and pencils and nervous anticipation became a night of screaming and fire. The fighters forced the students onto trucks, burning the school's examination hall and other buildings before driving off into the darkness toward their base in the vast and dense Sambiza forest, about 60 kilometers southeast of Maiduguri. Some of the braver girls leaped from the moving trucks. 57 of them managed to escape in those first frantic minutes, sprinting into the bush and hiding until dawn. The remaining 219 were swallowed by the forest. The response from the Nigerian government was devastatingly slow. President Goodluck Jonathan's administration took days to publicly acknowledge the abduction, and when they did, it was with assurances that the girls would be recovered quickly. Those assurances proved hollow. As weeks turned into months and the girls remained in captivity, anger erupted both within Nigeria and around the world. The hashtag #BringBackOurGirls went viral, championed by global figures including then United States First Lady Michelle Obama and activist Malala Yousafzai. Thousands of people marched in Nigerian cities and in capitals around the globe, demanding action. Within the forest, the captive girls were subjected to horrors that would only come to light in fragments, as some eventually returned. Many were forced to convert to Islam at gunpoint. Those who refused were beaten, starved, and subjected to forced labor. Many were given as so-called wives to Boko Haram fighters, forced into marriages and enduring sexual slavery. Some became pregnant by their captors. Others were reportedly trained and used as suicide bombers. The defiant ones, those who continued to resist conversion or marriage, faced the worst punishments, reduced to what survivors later described as domestic servitude, cooking and cleaning for the very men who held them prisoner, while enduring ongoing physical and psychological abuse. One survivor, Hawa Ishaya, who was 16 at the time of her abduction, later described 3 harrowing years in captivity, during which she was beaten repeatedly and pressured constantly to take a Boko Haram husband. She refused adamantly and was made into what she called a slave, attending to the needs of her married classmates and even treating wounded fighters. Despite everything, she said she clung to hope, longing for the day she would see her family again. When that day finally came in May 2017, she said the tears flowed freely as she embraced her loved ones. She is now studying communication and multimedia at a university, aspiring to a career in media. Another survivor, Amina Ali, became the first Chibok girl to break free in May 2016, escaping with the man Boko Haram had forced her to marry. She had a daughter from that forced marriage, and the child has already faced social stigma, labeled a child of Boko Haram by other children. Amina admitted that being a single mother in her circumstances was not easy, but she was pursuing her studies and hoping to become an entrepreneur. Between 2016 and 2017, following negotiations between the Nigerian government and Boko Haram, 103 girls were released in several small groups, reportedly in exchange for imprisoned militants, and according to some reports, substantial ransom payments. 20 of the girls who escaped in the immediate aftermath eventually moved to the United States to continue their education. Some of the freed girls were enrolled at the American University of Nigeria in Yola, Adamawa State, where they received psychological treatment and special foundation courses designed to help them obtain qualifications and rebuild their shattered lives. But the scars of captivity ran deep. Survivors described nightmares that never stopped, flashbacks triggered by ordinary sounds, and a crippling anxiety about the world outside the walls of their university. Those who returned with children fathered by their captors faced the cruelest stigma of all: rejection by the very communities that had prayed for their return. As of the most recent reports, roughly 90 of the original 276 Chibok girls remain unaccounted for. Some are believed to still be in captivity. Others, tragically, are believed to have died. A spokesman for the Parents Association put the number of confirmed dead at over 30, not including 11 girls who were reportedly killed in Boko Haram attacks in November 2014. The Nigerian government has largely moved on, consumed by competing crises, including more recent mass kidnappings. with over 1,600 children abducted from northern Nigerian schools since 2014, according to Save the Children. For the parents still waiting in Chibok, the silence from the government is deafening. One father, Enoch Mark, whose 2 daughters were among those taken, said the authorities act as if they are happy about what happened. He said they have lost hope in the government, but will never stop believing their daughters will come home, even in 100 years. The epidemic of school kidnappings in Nigeria did not end with Chibok. It mutated and spread, as if the original crime had torn a hole in the social fabric that could never be repaired. 4 years later, in a town not far from Chibok, the nightmare replayed itself with one devastating difference: a single hostage whose refusal to break became a symbol of faith and resistance known around the world. On February 19, 2018, at around 5:30 in the evening, a faction of Boko Haram, known as the Islamic State West Africa Province, stormed the Government Girls Science and Technical College in the town of Dapchi in Yobe State, roughly 275 kilometers northwest of Chibok. 110 schoolgirls, aged 11 to 19, were seized by the militants and loaded into vehicles. 5 of those girls would die on the very day of their abduction, though the circumstances of their deaths would not be confirmed until later. The pattern was hauntingly familiar. The Nigerian army had removed a military checkpoint from the town. The governor of Yobe State blamed the military. The government scrambled to respond. The international community watched, weary and heartbroken. But the Dapchi kidnapping took an unexpected turn. Within a month, on March 21, 2018, Boko Haram fighters drove back into Dapchi in a convoy of 9 vehicles and returned 106 of the kidnapped children, including 104 schoolgirls, 1 girl who didn't attend the school, and a boy. Information Minister Lai Mohammed declared the release was unconditional, though the United Nations later reported that a huge ransom had been paid. As the fighters unloaded the children, they issued a warning to the parents. They told them never to send their daughters to school again. They said, in their words, that Western education is forbidden. But 1 girl did not come home. 14-year-old Leah Sharibu, a Christian, had refused to renounce her faith when the militants demanded she convert to Islam as a condition of her release. Her classmates, the Muslim girls, were loaded back into the trucks and driven home. Leah was kept behind. Her mother, Rebecca Sharibu, was among the parents celebrating the return of the other girls when she realized her daughter was not among them. She asked where Leah was, and one of the freed girls gave her the answer. Leah had refused to convert. They kept her. In the years since, fragments of Leah's fate have emerged through testimony from other freed captives and intelligence reports, and they paint a picture of unimaginable suffering. According to the Christian Solidarity Worldwide organization, Leah was given to a Boko Haram fighter as a slave. In August 2018, an audio recording was released by her captors in which Leah, then 15, pleaded for her freedom. In October of that year, her parents revealed that Boko Haram had threatened to execute her if their demands were not met by the end of the month. The deadline passed without action. Reports surfaced in January 2020 that Leah had been forcibly converted to Islam, married off to a Boko Haram commander, and had given birth to a son. Her father, Nathan Sharibu, rejected the reports, saying he did not want to hear such news. Subsequent accounts from former captives who spent time with Leah confirmed that she gave birth to a second child later in 2020 and a third around April 2023. According to one pastor close to the family, Reverend Dr. Gideon Paramalam, the pain of slavery was one of the key reasons that motivated Leah to outwardly convert to Islam in order to regain some measure of freedom and human dignity. Captives reduced to slavery endured ongoing sexual abuse, including rape. The pastor said that without doubt, in his mind, Leah remained a secret believer in a complicated context, and he urged the international community not to give up praying and advocating for her release and the release of the other women and girls still in Boko Haram captivity. In late 2024, a Christian nurse named Alice Lokshangada, who had been kidnapped from a displaced persons camp near Ran, Borno State, 2 weeks after Leah's abduction in March 2018, and held captive alongside her for years, managed to escape from Boko Haram when internal fighting caused the leadership structure of the faction holding her to crumble. Alice told Leah's family that Leah was alive, that she was doing well under the circumstances, and that Rebecca should not lose hope because one day Leah would come back. Rebecca, Leah's mother, who has endured years of emotional trauma and whose health has visibly deteriorated under the crushing weight of uncertainty, took the words to heart. She continued to plead with the international community, with churches, with governments, with anyone who would listen. Her voice, once strong, now comes in haggard waves, and her eyes carry a permanent sadness etched in deeply drawn lines. But her message has never wavered. As of February 2026, 8 years after she was taken from her school at the age of 14, Leah Sharibu remains in captivity. She turned 22 in May of 2025. She has now spent more of her life as a prisoner than as a free girl. She has never returned home. She has never celebrated a birthday with her family. She has never finished her education. She has become one of the most enduring symbols of the cost of faith and resistance in the face of terror, a symbol that human rights organizations and governments invoke at press conferences and in policy reports. But for her mother, Rebecca, none of that matters. Leah is not a symbol. She is a daughter who never came back from school, and every day that passes without her is a day of pain that no amount of advocacy can erase. Every case we've discussed tonight, from the sunlit shores of Adelaide to the dark forests of northeastern Nigeria, shares a common thread. Not just the horror of people being taken, but the agony of not knowing. The families in these cases don't have graves to visit. They don't have trial transcripts to read. They have absence stretching out in front of them like a road with no end, and every day they walk it. They carry the same questions they carried on the very first day. Where are they? Who took them? Are they suffering? Are they still alive? If any of these cases has resonated with you, or if you want to help keep them in the public eye, the simplest thing you can do is share them with someone who hasn't heard the story. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Every subscriber helps us keep telling these stories so that the people at the heart of them are never forgotten. Until next time, stay safe out there.